Well, I think most of the things I would have talked about have just been addressed. But it is important that, when someone first goes to the agency, they don't know what to expect. When I first went, there'd just been a fuss in the papers about 10 people complaining about a variety of things. So I remember asking Dick Kraut, who was then the director, what does this mean? What's going on here? And he said, don't believe everything you read in the papers. So that was an important first lesson. But the truth is, what I found is that it's a never-ending fountain of things that are interesting. And they're all important, too. I mean, after all, what are we doing? We're deciding on whether drugs should be approved, but we're also trying to give people advice about how to study drugs properly so they'll do it efficiently, get the right answer, and not waste time doing silly studies. And I would say one of my major areas of interest all along, which keeps getting enhanced as we discover more things, has been about how to do that, how not to do the wrong study, how not to be informed. So a lot of the things that I've worked on are how to do good studies when you can't include a placebo, how to do a non-inferiority study, because there are many cases where you can't leave people untreated, so you have to get it right, it has to be credible. And then in the early 80s, I began to talk about how to use enrichment designs. Everybody always did that, but they never called them that, so it was important to call them that. And there's just a million places where who you put in the study determines whether or not you're going to win or not. Just as an example related to the elderly, in all these studies of anti-diabetic drugs where we're trying to rule out a particular risk of cardiovascular disease, you have to put people at high risk in the studies or you won't have enough events to get the answer, which has resulted in a relatively elderly population in those trials, because who's at risk? The elderly are. I'm not sure how it happened, but I somehow got involved in elderly stuff early. In 1982, the National Institute of Aging said we really ought to have guidance on including people, including elderly people in trials. So I remember we told them, good, why don't you write it? And they said, no, you should. So in 1982, after a paper in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, we wrote a draft guidance on including the elderly. It was made final in 1989, and then ICH did another one. But that was my first introduction, and I don't know why, but it did lead to an error. I was 41, and we defined elderly as 65. Trust me, totally wrong. But since everybody always does what we tell them to do, when a study called the Infusion Study looked at who was in trials, they found good inclusion of people over 65, but hardly anybody over 75. So that led to a change in the ICH guidance, which said, oh, by the way, don't stop at 65, study older people. And in a 2012 modification, they strongly urge doing that. Whether it's been successful or not, it's too soon to know. But I can tell you that in the trials of the novel anticoagulants, now that is a disease that's for atrial fibrillation, which is heavily elderly, the average age was over 73 or something like that in those trials, which gives you an impressive thing and is relevant to bleeding and all kinds of stuff. So that was very important. The guidance on the elderly was also the first manifestation of a serious interest in demographic subsets, which we now know is in the regulations, and we've got all kinds of guidance on how you're always supposed to do those analyses. But that was the first real manifestation. It was followed by a gender/sex guidance later. The guidance on how to do trials goes to a lot of things. So I've also been involved in guidance on adaptive designs, another thing that can make trials more efficient, and as a general matter on how to make trials more efficient altogether. There's lots of things that people never do. We never see crossover trials. That's a more efficient use of a small population. but it needs work to help people be convinced that we won't throw them out or hate them because there's a sequential bias or something like that. So all of those things are worth thinking about. I also want to mention that, for better or worse, a colleague and I wrote the accelerated approval rule, which we're probably really grateful for, right? Anyway. Finally, it's worth mentioning that over the years, you learn all kinds of things that you didn't know. For example, everybody in the room knows that you've got to specify your statistical plan at the outset of a study and say who you're going to include and who you're not going to include, and don't deviate from that without explanation. We didn't always know that. In about 1978, we got to review something called the Anturane reinfarction trial. That was a study of a drug called sulfonpyrazone, a drug that's used for gout, but that also inhibits platelet function. And it was published in the New England Journal, got great praise from all kinds of respected cardiologists. And it came into us for review, and we dawdled for a while. And finally, Dr. Kraut said, I want an answer in 4 weeks. This is important. It also went to an advisory committee which recommended approval. When we began to look at the data, we discovered that 9 patients who had died in the trial had been removed from the analysis. And the ratio was 8-to-1, 8 Anturane deaths and 1 placebo death. Why? 3 of the patients hadn't taken their drug. They knew that because when they died, they found the drug in their room. So they were excluded. That was 2-to-1. But there were 6 more who shouldn't have been entered because they didn't meet the entry criteria. Their heart attack was 1 day too late or whatever it was. So they were excluded. That removed 6 deaths from the Anturane trial. So the apparently statistical significant effect went away when you threw those back in. We had no idea about that sort of thing now, but it helped us understand it. In addition, the study showed its predominant effect on what was called sudden death, as opposed to heart attack deaths. When we went and looked at the individual death reports, it turned out that if you were on Anturane, you had an MI from the same pattern of events that if you had the same obstruction of a coronary artery and you were in the placebo group, you got called sudden death. So sudden deaths were elevated in the placebo group by this misnaming. And that was the second part of the funny outcome of the result. It's of interest that the description of the cause of death had a separate data sheet that was provided. When we first got the application, all of the case report forms were retyped. Fortunately, Dr. John Harder, who was there at the time, said, come on, that's not a case report form, give us the print. But that page was left out of every one of the retyped ones, so we never would have been able to know that the events were misclassified. So all of those things taught us about large outcome trials, something we'd never known before. And there's just thousands of such experiences, which is part of why it's such an exciting place. You keep learning and you keep trying to do better and better. And it's all for a good purpose. And finally, the last thing I would say is what's been most exciting to me about being there is that I wouldn't have known this in advance. I'm not an admirer of all bureaucracies, you know. The overwhelming passion of people there is to get the right answer. That's the main thing, maybe the only thing they really want. They talk about it in the hallways, and it's a great place to be.